thank you very much to Mike. It's funny you said all the way from London, because when Mike was pitching this, he said, it's actually a really pleasant 3-hour journey on the train. He said, you'll actually really enjoy it. It's like, it wasn't sort of a downside, it was actually part of why I should come, because you'll enjoy the train ride. So I'm going to speak about climate change, which is a heavy, difficult, complex topic that many of you know. I'm going to speak about it quite personally in terms of my own sort of journey with it, for want of a better term. And then we want to get everyone involved in really thinking harder about what to do about it. The best place to start is a little bit about myself, and I want to know just a little bit about who's in the room as well. I grew up in Scotland. I developed diabetes when I was age 6. Allegedly, this made me a little bit self-aware. With that self-awareness, I kind of started thinking about things. Allegedly, that led me to become a chess player. I got very good at that, and that helped me in my schoolwork. I did some good degrees. I learned some stuff, and then I was becoming a father, and I decided that I couldn't play chess anymore because it was too unpredictable and involved too much travel. So I had better get something resembling a proper job, and I ended up seeing a job advert for the something at the RSA in London, the Royal Society of Arts, and I ended up applying and taking it. And shortly afterwards, I evolved within that job to something called the Social Brain Project. The Social Brain Project was broadly about our understanding of human nature not being quite right. It's about the notion that human beings are a great deal less rational and a great deal less individualistic than we typically think. Whether you look at it from a sort of evolutionary psychology or behavioral economics or neuroscience, you find that human beings are actually very, very automatic creatures. We're hugely habitual and also deeply, deeply social, highly sensitive to what other people are doing and what is expected of us as normal behavior. So a lot of the Social Brain Project was about looking at the axioms of public policy, the assumptions about human behavior within them, and then trying to think of how we do differently if we saw those axioms from a different perspective. Now that's all fine, and then you bring an issue like climate change on board, and that's exactly what happened in my case. I'd written a report called Transforming Behavior Change. It was called Beyond Nudge in Neuromania. It was deliberately tacked on to sort of be contra nudge and contra this worship and veneration of neuroscience. It was a way of saying behavior change is more than that. Behavior change has got to be more reflexive and reflective, has to be more about our own self-awareness. And as I wrote that, it went quite well. I got a phone call from a climate change funder who said, look, you've done some interesting stuff on behavior change. Can you tell us something about how behavior change might apply to the challenges of climate change? And I said, well, yeah, why not? I guess it can apply. I'll think about it. And that began what was initially going to be quite a short project, but it went to a whole year. So I spent the best part of a whole year thinking about climate change. And one of the most helpful parts of that journey was reading Mike and Duncan's book, The Burning Question, which is an invaluable guide along the way. And what happens is when you open your mind to that, when you have this kind of global consciousness of the climate problem, behavior change looks very different. You could say that climate change changes behavior change, because the typical approach to behavior change is about saving energy at home, about getting people to insulate their attics and put cavities, get the right wall cavity and so forth. But actually, it doesn't really cut it. Once you start looking at the climate problem in more depth, you realize it's not deep enough. The problems are much deeper, they're much more global, they're much more systemic. And that's kind of where the report ended up. It was about trying to link this individual action to the global problem and just how huge and macroscopic that is. That's a little bit about me and sort of setting the scene for what I'm about to say. But I want to get a sense of who's in the room and who's not in the room. So I'm guessing, how many students are here, please? And and lecturers or academics more broadly conceived? Yeah, okay. And then people from the town was how it was called earlier. Yeah, people coming from elsewhere. Civil society, welcome. That's a good sort of snapshot. Can I also ask, how many people here would describe themselves as environmentalists? Okay, about half, roughly. Okay, because part of what I'm going to say is that I think environmentalism is not part of the problem as such, but the fact that climate change is exclusively viewed as an environmental problem is a big part of the challenge. And it's how do you avoid being churlish and avoid saying to the people who've done all the best work in this domain and given their lives towards it that somehow we need a framing that keeps you as part of the picture but not necessarily the dominant part. Another question, how many people here, if you're willing to, and you can keep this private, but would describe yourself as broadly on the right of the political spectrum? Right, nobody. Okay, nobody. Okay, that's exactly how I thought it might be. How many people here working in the private sector? Okay, a few more, but still, okay, fine. Okay, so a small minority. So that's interesting, because often what you find with climate change is that there's a real danger of preaching to the converted. Depends on how you look at this, but broadly speaking, if you're of the sort of center-left persuasion, climate change can look like quite a convenient thing. It can look like the kind of issue that is very syntonic and feeds into your values very comfortably, because it makes it easier to think about, what should be done. The government ought to do something, and that instinct of appealing to the government to act is actually falls out of climate change quite nicely. Whereas if you're on the right and you don't want the government interference, the climate change message is not quite so easy to hear. It's much harder to know exactly what to do. Of course, there are market solutions and so forth, but that's not as easy a sort of framing for people on the right to sort of accept. Now, I want to speak a bit about denial, because in some ways that was the heart of the report. That was really the defining theme. The report title is called, actually, what is it called? No, it's called Facing Up to Stealth Denial and Winding Down on Fossil Fuels. And those two things are sort of equally important. So those of you who knows Mike's work will know that we need to get away from the idea that climate change is about national emissions and get a broader sense of the global patterns of fossil fuel production. Because unless you do that, the emissions curve just keeps on going up. And that's a sort of very, very quick snapshot of the problem. But in essence, the solution has to be about keeping oil, gas, and coal in the ground as far as possible. We can come back to explaining why that is. But the other side of the story is the one I want to focus on, because that's the one that's a bit harder and a bit more difficult to speak about. And one of the reasons I'm speaking without notes is because I actually think we need a more emotional, more interpersonal, more effective response to the problem that's less about information dissemination and more about emotion. So I am living in a Western context. I have a home, I have a family. I fly to India every so often because my wife's Indian. I don't know exactly what my carbon footprint is, but it's probably not particularly great. I find myself wanting to do more about climate change, but not really being able to. I'm caught up in all sorts of patterns that I really can't escape from, patterns of consumption, patterns of debt sometimes, patterns of relating to other people, of meals out that you can't really avoid or wouldn't necessarily want to avoid. Lots of sort of behaviors that are just deeply embedded in the world around us. So it's in that context that the climate change message comes in, and we have to receive it with those relationships, with those social contexts, with those cultural contexts. And what do we do with it? So what people on the left typically do is they say, look, it's those climate deniers, they're the problem. It's the sort of the Rowsons of the world, the global warming policy foundations of the world, who are giving this misinformation saying that climate change is not real. They're the problem. If only they would stop it, we would get the scientific message and everything would be fine. It's not true. It's not true at all. The deeper problem, I strongly believe, is really ourselves. It's the forms of denial that are much more tacit and subtle and personal. And what we did in the report was a seemingly impossible task. If anyone's taught a methodology class at university, a social science methodology class, you'd be sort of screaming at some of the assumptions we made, because what we tried to do is map on deep complexity of the human psyche and the forms of denial, which has been written about by Freud and all sorts of other people, onto the crude instrument of a national survey. Now, how can you possibly do that? A national survey gives you multiple choice options, and you're being asked things about how you feel about the climate problem, which of these emotions correspond to your feelings about it. And it's not academically completely sound. There's a question of how do you do this? On the other hand, we know it's true. There's a very real sense in which it doesn't surprise people to say, look, lots of people who accept the problem intellectually don't live as though they do. That doesn't seem surprising, right? We know that there's a gap between the message about the reality of climate change, what it might mean for us, and the way we live our lives. And it's not really connecting. For most people, there is a huge mismatch. So we tried to make that empirical. We tried to give that empirical reference points. And we spoke about personal denial, which is broadly, I see that the problem is there, but it's nothing to do with me. We spoke about emotional denial, which is broadly, I see that the problem is there, but I don't feel particularly uneasy about it. And we spoke about practical denial, which is broadly, I can see that the problem is there, but there's nothing I can do about it. And we said that if you correspond to any one of those things, you have a form of what we call stealth denial. And stealth denial was a phrase chosen to be deliberately slightly toxic, because nobody wants to be thought to be in stealth denial. But in effect, stealth denial means it's an open secret. It's like this phenomenon of climate change and not facing up to it is probably the biggest open secret we're living with at the moment. We all know it's there. We know the months are going by. It's getting more serious all the time. And we're not really acting with sufficient clarity and conviction. And that's most of us. And we're sort of somehow stuck and don't quite know what to do about it. And the months go by. So why is that? Why is it? Because there's so many competing commitments. There are just so many competing commitments, and yet the debate is never framed as a problem of competing commitments. The debate is always framed as scientists says X, we must do Y, noise, noise, noise. A few things happen, but not commensurate with the nature of the problem. So the question is, what would it mean to really get serious? What would it mean to really wake up to the problem? And it would mean a really radical transformation of the world as we know it. It would mean very rapid deployment of renewable energies with suitable storage facilities, with suitable transport facilities. It would mean a massive flow of money moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. It might mean something for nuclear, it might not, that's a whole other debate. But certainly the climate challenge would look, if we really took it seriously, it would have implications for economic growth potentially. Not necessarily stopping growth, but thinking hard about the purposes of growth and where we're putting the proceeds of growth. It would certainly have an issue for government subsidies. And socially, it would mean things about social norms. It would mean people's phones going off in the middle of talks, using energy we don't need to use. They would be on silent automatically, probably, because we wouldn't have to waste that energy. Now, the problem of competing commitments is best seen in energy. Now, climate change is ultimately about energy. You're using a lot of energy here, I can see, which is nice. The framing on energy I like the most, and the one I never hear about in the media, and I think it's a good indication of the problem. How many of you heard the expression, the energy trilemma? Is it a new expression? We have one or two nods, okay. So for me, this is a very obviously useful way of talking about energy, and yet you never hear it on Question Time. You never hear it on the Today program. It's just not there. People talk about climate change on the one hand, energy on the other, and economic growth on the other, as if they're sort of nothing to do with each other. And that's a huge part of the problem. The energy trilemma broadly is, three different things that we need and can't really drop any of them. And yet, it's very hard to actually have all of them. On the one hand, you need energy security. So you need the lights to stay on. You need the cars to keep going, especially at certain times of the day. You need a lot of energy, and that needs to be reliable. So energy security is one major part of the trilemma. Then you have fuel poverty or energy prices. Is a big part of the dilemma is how do you get affordable energy for people? And we know that's been a big part of the news. Fuel prices is a big electoral issue now, one of the major ones according to some polls. And then you have climate change, reducing emissions, energy efficiency and so forth. And these three things actually, it's quite hard to get them working together. It's not straightforward to at once have a reliable supply of energy, to also have fuel, prices relatively low, and to have an energy sort of supply that keeps emissions very, very low and helps to keep fossil fuels in the ground. It's very difficult to get all three. And that's really the heart of the trade-off. It's like, how do you, if you want to move towards renewables, tell me about your plan for energy security and fuel prices. If you want to stay on fossil fuels, tell me your plan for lowering emissions. But you almost never hear that. And that's the language of competing commitments. We need to move the debate away from is the problem happening to how do we actually wrestle with these different aspects of the problem. The other thing I want to share is about the environmental issue, about why is it maybe slightly problematic that climate change is viewed as principally environmental. I'm not an environmentalist, actually, by most conventional definitions. I don't think much about a lot of the signifiers that would characterize environmentalism. I think it's pretty obvious you need a livable planet. It's pretty obvious you need good air. You want to make the best use of your natural resources. You don't want to squander that. You don't want to harm it beyond repair. I have no particular ill will towards any creatures. There's, in all of these dimensions, I'm quite sort of friendly towards the natural world. But I'm not really motivated by it. I'm not strongly motivated by keeping the landscape looking a certain way, keeping the sort of environmental systems working a certain way. If I was more aware of it, I might be. But climate change hits me much more directly. It hits me sort of in a way that I feel I have to respond to it, in a way lots of environmental issues don't. And I believe I'm not alone. I believe lots of people feel this way. Because when you look at climate change closely, you realize it's driven by the social logic of consumption. It's driven by a certain pattern in the economy that says we need energy to fulfill certain objectives. And you realize as well that it's entirely global. It's not about habitats. It's not about particular places, typically. It's about global patterns of fossil fuel production. So what follows? We need the framing of environmentalism also puts off a lot of people on the right. And look, whether you're on the right or not, there are lots of people who are. And you need them to some extent to be on board, or at least to be hearing the message. You need them in the room, which they're not at the moment. You need them to be able to see themselves in the problem in a way that its current framing doesn't always allow. Framing it as a purely environmental problem makes those who don't see themselves as environmentalists feel like it's not their problem. And of course it's everyone's problem. So that's sort of a big part of the challenge. And also environmental doesn't quite get at the systemic nature of it. Because environmental, for most people, for those who understand it well, know that you can't really be environmental without also being social, economic, psychological, and so forth. But that's only when you know it well. For most people, environmentalism means something else entirely. So the challenge is, how do you bring in these other factors, the psychological factors, the economic factors, the political factors, and so forth? And that got me thinking, well, what would a framing of the climate change challenge look like that actually brought more people on board, that was less threatening to people? And that's where I came up with this notion of 7 dimensions. And that taps into my psychology background a bit. There's a famous paper by George Miller, some of you might know, called The Magical Number 7 ± 2. And it's based on, it's no coincidence that most phone numbers used to, at least before our phones recorded them, be roughly 7 digits long. And it's because your mind can sort of hold 7 units of information at once without any particular effort. And so I thought, well, what would those 7 ingredients be? And I started to think that we need all of them. You need a framing that actually captures all of these things. So let me run through that so that we can get to the questions. Science, obviously. I mean, science is what tells us this problem is there. Science is the sort of touchstone, the facts, the figures. And the challenge for scientists is how do you, they're struggling currently to communicate this problem and it's not getting through. Technology. Well, if we're going to have renewable energy that works at scale and provides energy security in an affordable way, you need, probably more investment, but you need also breakthroughs so that you can have energy storage and transportation that works en masse. Law, you need constraints at scale. Law is, we don't often hear law and climate change together, but when you start thinking about it, really, whether it's a global treaty, the one that will really work, or whether it's something like the provision of, the ecocide, I don't know if you've come across that expression, but some people believe that we need a law to sort of capture this damage to the planet that's being done, that sort of respects the rights of nature in that way. Or it could be something simpler like, the fiduciary duty of shareholders. If your only obligation is to the next quarter, it's quite difficult to think long term and to factor in something like climate change. So it could be that, one of the main things that lawyers can do is help to clarify how do you change that statement that obliges people to, give shareholder value in a way that factors in the future. And you might only need one line to the key part of your company's constitution that says we will respect, we will keep the future interests in mind, or something as benign as that will give people the wiggle room necessary to make different decisions. And then the economy is huge. In fact, climate change for me personally, I think is principally an economic thing. It's all of these things. It's not one more than any others. But I get really annoyed when I hear in the media people speaking about the economy and economic projections, and they just don't factor in these sort of future issues relating to climate change. Growth is clearly, I think, it's complex because a capitalist economy relies on growth. You have investment and return. You can't just turn the taps off. You can't stop riding the bike. On the other hand, there's clearly a kind of fetishization of growth. There's a sort of notion that growth somehow is the answer to all the problems when it isn't. And yet, at the same time, we can't just stop it. So there's a real conundrum there as to how do you frame that problem. There's the circular economy and various other economic models that might try and square that circle, but it's not easy. And you have democracy. Some people see climate change as the nemesis of capitalism. Others see it as a nemesis of democracy. Because really, you have a huge collective action problem. And it's not just a collective action problem at one level. It's everywhere you go. All the way from your sort of street level about where the solar panels are going to be and where the power is going to be, to the sort of absolute international global level as to which countries are going to take the biggest sort of responsibilities on. And then you have culture. Culture is crucially important. What do we hear in the media at the moment? The media is still caught up on, is this happening or not? The media is still about, is climate change real? And that's a real problem. We need to move that on to what do we do about it, and fast. The debates should be vigorous, lovely debates between people saying, no, it's all about this market solution or this carbon tax, or it's all about less emissions, or it's about stopping economic growth. Whatever it is, we need them to move on to that. And then behavior. Finally, it's about us. It's about what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's our psyches and also our practices, social practices. The things that we assume to be normal, like all of us having a washing machine as normal, all of us having a shower every day as normal, all of us having, all of us eating in our own homes rather than eating collectively. Lots of things which are very energy consumptive, which are just part of our social practices that don't have to be that way. So at every level, for all the way from science to technology to law to the economy to democracy to culture and to behavior, you're looking at deep, knotty, complex problems at each level, which is why climate change has been called a super wicked problem. It's not just wicked, it's not just hard to define, and there's a classic literature on wicked problems. Climate change is called super wicked because it's even worse than that. And if I'm honest, spending this year with climate change, there were moments where I felt quite depressed, actually, quite kind of, the scale of the problem and the difficulty, first of all, grasping it, and secondly, doing anything about it. It's quite overwhelming, quite dispiriting at times. And we need to get to a place that's positive, but sort of authentically so. And some people say the only way we're going to get there is a kind of collective dark night of the soul. So that instead of giving people the positive spin, look, it's great, you just change your light bulbs, you just get a more efficient car, you consume a little bit less maybe, you fly a little bit less, you might eat meat a few days less a week and so forth, and everything will be fine. Forgive my French camera, but bullshit. It's not going to happen. It's just not true. The problem is much, much deeper. It's much more global, and anyone who looks at it for a few minutes with honesty can see that. These minor efforts are important. They're part of the transition, they're part of the culture change, but they're really the thin end of the wedge. So what would it mean to be authentically positive? It would mean, first of all, accepting the negativity, and taking it on board, and moving beyond it. So my own view is, with people like Kevin Anderson, don't hold back, personally. I think be as positive as you can be while keeping your integrity. Be honest about it. The situation is quite dire. And there are problems there for communicating to people, that people can switch off. People don't want to hear it. There are defense mechanisms, and we can speak about all that. But there's also a place for confidently and honestly sharing your view of how dire the situation is, but still living a good life. Not collapsing in a heap and holding up your hands and saying we're all doomed. Finding an authentically positive response is the challenge. The last thing to say is this map of 7 dimensions. And I was thinking about maps more generally. Some of you, I'm guessing if you're a sort of broadly greenish environmental group, have been on the old spiritual retreat. And there you might have heard the expression, the map is not the territory. It's a famous kind of Zen saying. Any given map is just a very poor representation of the lived experience of a particular place or experience. But then I sort of looked a bit more deeply into this expression. There's a lovely story by Lewis Carroll, in which one of the groups in his story create a map that's got a scale of 1 mile to 1 mile. It's actually, they make their map of reality, literally trying to get beyond that problem. But then the practical problems are so significant that at the end of it they say, actually we ditched the map and we decided just to deal with the real thing instead. And they said, and actually most of the time it works just as well. So that's my way of saying that this map, I acknowledge, it's just a way of thinking about it a bit differently. The purpose of it are threefold, and I'll end with that. The first purpose is to shift away from principally environmental framing. This map doesn't preclude environmentalism, it gives a home for them, it gives a place for them to act, but it moves away from the idea that climate change is principally environmental. It shows its broader systemic pattern. The second is that it helps that systems thinking because it gives you these clear coordinates and reference points to actually start thinking more productively about how these different parts intersect. What is the connection between the economy and democracy? How much do people need a conventional measure of economic growth? What are the trade-offs people are willing to make? What would it take to make those legal changes? How do the scientists need to communicate better with us to get the message through? How can we help technology get the new technologies we need and so forth? So it's partly about giving you the coordinates for that sort of way of thinking. And finally, it's about identification. You may not see yourself directly in any of those, but most of us can, if we look, say, well, I'm not really a scientist, so I don't quite belong there, but I'm very much political animal. I can see myself in the democracy part. Or actually, I like thinking about the economy, or I have a business, or I want to know what's happening in the economy part. And we know for a fact one of the big problems with climate change is that people are switched off because on the one hand, it's just too vast and too big to get a hook on it. And so this is a way of saying, well, look, here's your entry point. Here's a place you can find where you can begin to think what's happening in that domain, in that dimension. So it's a map, but I hope a relatively good one. And with that, I'll take some questions.